Hello there! Welcome to Skeleton Productions. I'm JohnCCalhoun. Let's get into the video. Today's video we're going to be asking the question of what if the nullification crisis started the American Civil War? Now I know that many of you will be like, that is a very wordy title, and also what the hell is the nullification crisis? And actually, you know what? When I first heard the idea for this video, that's what I thought as well. Because this idea was actually suggested by one of our subscribers, so Greater McCheesy, yes, I think that's his Christian name, and yeah, yeah. Anyway, so yes, so that was suggested by them. So when I first heard the idea, they was basically saying, oh, what if the American Civil War was 30 years earlier? And I was like, why would it be 30 years earlier? Like, and so, they said nullification crisis. I looked into it because I know a little about it, but I didn't really know that much about it. So upon looking into it, I was like, wow, okay, this is an alternative history scenario I can run with, right? So the nullification crisis of 1828 to 1832/3, this was all to do with tariffs. So tariffs are taxes on imports, and the idea behind it is basically that, if your country is producing things and another country is producing things, if a foreign country is able to produce things at a cheaper rate than yours, then that foreign country will basically be able to outsell your stuff, and then your domestic industries are not going to be able to take off as well. So people will just buy the cheaper stuff, and your industries will either not take off or they'll collapse. So in the early years of the American Republic, what a lot of states, especially in the North, wanted was to build up domestic industry. And so these were the states which mainly pushed for these higher tariffs because they wanted to outcompete the British, who were sending cheaper manufactured goods, and they wanted to be able to produce these goods for themselves. However, the southern states at that time were not very industrialized, right? They were agrarian, they were agricultural, and most importantly of all, they had the so-called peculiar institution of slavery. And so people in the South, they wanted to have cheap things, and they didn't benefit from higher prices because they didn't have any industry in the South. If you're mainly focused on slavery, you're focused on producing things such as cotton, such as tobacco, etc., and then exporting, right? And as we've discussed in our previous video about what if the South won the Civil War, definitely check that out. A lot of America's exports at that time were pretty much dominated by the South, and pretty much dominated especially by cotton production, which obviously came as a result of slave labor. So the South was very hostile to these tariffs. They wanted to have free trade. Now, in modern times, for the most part, we've come to the conclusion that protectionism, which is having tariffs, is bad, and that free trade is good. Because although you might lose some industries at home, it means that on the whole, the vast majority of people get cheaper things, and then they're able to use the money that they would otherwise be spending on those more expensive products, on other things, right? So it actually leads to a great deal of efficiency. So there's a so-called thing which Friedrich Bastiat, who's a French economist, said, which was the seen versus the unseen, right? So people in favor of protectionism go, right, we're going to see these industries here, we need to protect these industries, right? But the unseen thing is actually, what about the cost inferred on regular people, right? And actually, in the long term, free trade is better than protectionism. So it's kind of annoying that in this argument, the people who were most in favor of free trade happen to also be slave owners, right? So you're kind of like, the good people are kind of on the wrong side, if that makes sense, on this issue. But anyway, so at the time you had President Andrew Jackson, and he was of the Democratic Party, and he had a lot of support in the South. He won states in the North and the South, but predominantly his support was in the South. However, the vast majority of the population of America, even then, was predominantly in the North. For instance, the states of New York, Pennsylvania, and Ohio, their combined population was almost the same size of that of the entire South. So in terms of voting in the US Congress, they had a lot more sway than many places in the South. But we're going to get onto in a little bit just how much power the South actually had, So we can see this in the votes of 1828, 1832, and 1833. So in 1828, Congress passed a new bill, which was referred to as the Tariff of 1828, which later became known as the Tariff of Abominations. And as you can see on the screen here, they kind of had a point, because this was some of the highest tariff rates in all of American history. And this is part of what President Jackson wanted to do in order to pay down America's national debt. So actually he succeeded in doing this. He's the only president who actually succeeded in completely paying off America's national debt. And the way that he achieved this was through this tariff, yeah? So that was the rationale behind the tariff being as high as it was. However, as we can see in the votes here, it was an incredibly divisive thing. So although the total votes in the House were 105 to 94, when we split it down by region, we can start to see that actually it was a lot more divided than we might otherwise think. So in New England, it was supported by 16 congressmen to 23. So a majority of congressmen from New England were opposed to this tariff. But now when we look at the middle states, yeah, so this is states like Pennsylvania, New York, etc., etc. For these states, the vote came to 56 to 6. So you can already see that New England is opposed to it. However, the middle states are strongly in favour of it. And then when we look at the states out west, we can see that the vote is 29 to just 1. So overwhelmingly supported by states from the West, which we today would call the Midwest. This is states like Ohio, Michigan, etc., etc. You know, so these states, which later became the kind of like industrial belt, which is where a lot of like America's industry took place. These were the states where they wanted to industrialize the most, and this was why they were the states which were most in favor of this tariff. However, when we look at the South, we can see that just 4 congressmen from the South voted for this bill, and 64 of them voted against it. And then when we look at in terms of free states versus slave states, you know, so free states obviously being states where they banned slavery, we can see in the free states that the vote is 88 to 29, and in the slave states it's 17 to 65. So you can already start to see a very sharp split between the states that do have slavery and the ones that don't have slavery. And the states that do have slavery are very much opposed to it, and the states that don't have slavery and want to industrialize are very much in favor of this tariff. And out of all the southern slave states, the state in which it was hated the most was South Carolina. So President Jackson's vice president, John C. Calhoun, was a South Carolinian, and he was very much opposed to this tariff being implemented. So much so that he quit his role as VP and decided to stand up for South Carolina. And he, as well as many other politicians in South Carolina, pushed for something known as nullification. So nullification as a concept is something which was first floated about by Thomas Jefferson and by James Madison. So at the time of America's founding, you had a split between the founding fathers who wanted a more centralized federal government and ones who wanted more powers to the states. And Thomas Jefferson and James Madison were very much seen as anti-federalists, so they wanted more powers to be given to the states. And they proposed the idea that if a state didn't like a law passed by the federal government, they had the right to nullify that, which meant that they had the right to decide, no, we're not going to abide by this federal law, we are going to go about a different course, and if necessary, we have the right to secede, which means to leave the Union. And so it was on this principle that John C. Calhoun and other South Carolinians decided to take a stand on this issue. Now you might think that, okay, cool, it's a tariff, but like, come on now, just chill, okay? Just because a lot of people in your state didn't like it doesn't mean that you can just, you know, throw your toys out the pram and basically, you know, try to break away from the Union. However, people in the South felt very, very strongly about this, especially in South Carolina. So much so that in the election of 1832, they decided to run a party known as the Nullification Party. Now this party didn't run in any other state other than South Carolina, and actually there was no popular vote. So as we've discussed in previous videos, America, you know, when it comes to picking the president, it's picked by an electoral college. So the people from the states, when they decide like who the state should vote for, you know, you don't need a popular vote. And a clear example of this is in this election within South Carolina in 1832, because there actually was no popular vote for the presidency. Because the people from the South Carolina legislature, they decided that all of the electoral votes was going to go to this nullification party. So there was no campaigning, there was no votes, there was no one turned out to vote for this, right? This was just how it was. And to give a sense of just how strongly the people of South Carolina felt about this, when the vote went to the South Carolina state legislature, we saw that 96 to just 25 South Carolina congressmen decided to vote for nullification. And in the South Carolina Senate, it was 31 to 13. So that's roughly about 79% of people in the House and about 70% of people in the South Carolina Senate, right? So you can really see that people are deciding to vote for these politicians, and these politicians are coming out this strongly for this action, then it must mean that a lot of people in South Carolina were in favour of nullification. I just want to remind people that this vote in the South Carolina Congress came after there had already been a compromise tariff earlier that year. And this was a new and reduced set of tariffs, which were much less than they had been in the year of 1828. So looking at the House votes again for this year's vote, we can see that in New England it was 27-6, in the middle states it was 51-10, and in the western states it was 22-8. However, when it came to the South, the vote was 32-4 and 36 against. So we've almost got it now. We've got almost half of the southern politicians now to be in favour of this. We've got New England. Some people in the middle states and in the western states are not happy with it, but still an overwhelming majority are in favour of it, right? And as we can see from before, last time it was passed by 53% of the House. This time it's by 69%. However, when we look at this in terms of free states versus slave states, in the free states, we can see that it was supported by 92 to just 18. However, in the slave states, we can see it's supported by 40 to 42. So again, it's still very, very close. Like on paper, you've got 69% of the House being in favour of something. Okay, so what? Like some regions are not in favour of it, You've got not just a majority, you've got a super majority, How much more does the South have to kind of be catered to in this regard? And that's basically how probably a lot of people in the North felt, right? And this is kind of a prelude to what we can see in the years leading up to the Civil War, that time and time again, even though the North has got the majority, we can see that actually the South is able to basically hold back the whole rest of the Union, And it's to do with this peculiar institution, it's to do with the power that slavery had, and the fact that many people in the North, up until the time of Lincoln, were not in favour of actually really pushing the South. They want to compromise, they want to keep compromising. And this is what we can clearly see here. Even though you've got 69% of people in the House voting for this, just because a slight majority of politicians in the South are opposed to it, it means that the whole rest of it is kind of being undermined. And just to give an idea of just how serious South Carolina was about this, Governor Hayne decided to rally 2,000 mounted Minutemen. So basically these are people who are on horseback and they can be very quickly assembled. That's why they're called Minutemen. They're able to get up and be ready to fight within a minute. And on top of that, you had 25,000 infantry. So this shows just how serious they were. They were basically saying that we are going to nullify this law. We are not going to enforce this tariff within the state. And if the United States government wants to have a word with us about it, then they're going to have to fight their way through the state. And these 27,000 men are going to be ready to march on Charleston and take over the state, and if necessary, to secede from the Union and to go at it alone. So it was at this point that President Andrew Jackson called their bluff and decided that he was going to send US troops to surround the state of South Carolina and to warn them that if they pursued this policy of nullification, that federal troops would be marched into South Carolina. Now this is where this alternative history gets quite interesting, because the thing is, it's a bit different than how it was with regard to the American Civil War 30 years later, because South Carolina was basically by itself. The rest of the states in the South were not really in favour of seceding at that point, and actually several of the state legislatures from these different southern states were actually really opposed to it. So for instance, the state legislature of Alabama said that the policy was unsound in theory and dangerous in practice. The state of Georgia said that nullification was mischievous and it was rash and revolutionary. And the state of Mississippi said that they were acting with reckless precipitancy. So we can already see that actually the vast majority of southern states, even southern states which we think of as being like really hard line in favour of slavery, at that point they were not willing to split away from the Union, and actually said that South Carolina was basically going about it in a very dangerous way and that they were not in favour of it at all. So if the American Civil War began in 1832 instead of 1860, it would be very, very different, because obviously South Carolina in this case would have been on its own, right? If the rest of the southern states are not in favour of it, it would have just been a very quick and decisive war. However, it would have left a very bitter taste in the mouth of many South Carolinians, because they would have felt abandoned by their other slave states as well. So basically they would have had a very much of a kind of siege mentality, where everyone else in the Union is out to get them. However, the other alternative is that depending on how violently this is crushed, and obviously if it's President Jackson, he would have crushed it very, very ruthlessly. If you check out the history of President Jackson with the Indian removal, with just how he was as a general in general, whatever. Yeah, he was very, very brutal. So I think that if South Carolina had like actually risen up in this way, then the reaction to the repression of this state could have actually spurred a lot of southern states to have sympathy for them. Not necessarily saying that they would have broken away, but for instance, let's just say that they did break away. How would the Civil War have gone? Well, we can already kind of see from like the votes that were happening at this time that the North was very much in favour of compromising with the South. So I think if these states had just decided to rise up like this, I think probably they would have just come up with some sort of like compromise. So President Jackson's threat of using federal troops to crush South Carolina made the South Carolinians basically back off a little bit. For now, at least for now. Don't forget, obviously, that South Carolina was the first state to secede from the Union, the Battle of Fort Sumter in 1860. So just bear that in mind, that South Carolina is always itching for a bit of a fight. And out of all the different southern states, the institution of slavery was most instituted within South Carolina. You had the majority of a population who were slaves. As we discussed in our previous video of what if the South won the Civil War, South Carolina was really, really heavily invested in this institution. And actually, it's something to note that a lot of states in 1860/61, they split away from the Union, not because of the fact that they wanted to secede, but because they were opposed to federal troops marching through their area in order to crush these rebellious states. So for instance, the state of Virginia end up splitting away from the Union because they were opposed to federal troops marching through their state in order to crush the rebellious states. So not saying that this would have happened, but let's suppose that it did, right? States which would have been opposed to federal troops going through and crushing South Carolina, what's to say that North Carolina, what's to say that Georgia, what's to say that all these other states wouldn't have also risen up as well? So that's something to kind of bear in mind, that actually in the court of public opinion, quite a lot of people in the South, who were already, as we have seen from this, who were already very much opposed to this tariff, what's to say that as a reaction to this, they might also have seceded? So yeah, it's quite interesting. I think that the South probably still would have won, but at the same time, it's something to bear in mind that the North at that point, although it had a larger population, hadn't yet industrialised the same level as it was in 1860. So the gap between North and the South in 1832 probably was nowhere near as big as it was later to be in 1860. But anyway, South Carolina backed down. It decided not to nullify and decided not to secede. And a year later, you had the Compromise Tariff of 1833, and this was supported by 76%. So remember, the first vote, 53%. Second vote, 69%. The third vote, 76%. So it takes for the vote to be 76% of the House, just for people to just be like, right, that's enough now, that's enough. So this shows just how much people are trying to cater to the South. And we can see this in how the votes have broken down. So in New England, it's supported by 36 to just 1. In the middle states, it's supported by 53 to 6. In the western states, it's supported 22 to 5. And in the southern states, it's supported by 38 to 35. Finally, we've got a very close majority of the South who are in favour of this tariff, So the tariff rate had been reduced drastically, just to kind of appease the South. And again, when we look at this in terms of free states versus slave states, we can see that for free states, it's 102 to just 8. And for slave states, we can see that it's 47 to 39. So finally, majority of the South and the majority of slave states are finally in favour of a tariff. So this shows just how powerful the South was. So even though South Carolina has threatened to split away, even though it's supported by a vast majority of people in northern states, it still is a thing where they keep going, come on, let's compromise a little bit, let's compromise a little bit, let's compromise a little bit. So I think that a civil war in this instance, first of all, would be at a much smaller scale than it was in 1860. And second of all, even if it had kind of kicked off, I think it would have been far less bloody than the one in 1860, because there would have been much more of a feeling for compromise than there was in the 1860 Civil War. So yeah, so with that being said, basically come to the end of this alternate history. So so I hope you liked that video. If you did, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe, share with a friend. So this is the new target, So each person has at least one friend, right? I assume each of my subscribers have at least one friend. So what you need to do is you need to take one of my videos, and I've got over 100 at the moment, so just look through them, find a video and be like, oh, that person would like that, and share that video to them and see what they think of it. Because that's what's going to help my channel to grow, by you sharing with people, right? So sharing is caring, spread the love, spread the likes, spread the comments, etc., etc. And also as well, as we said, we're coming to the end of our alternative history series. So, this was suggested by one of the fans. So don't forget to, if you have any ideas, get these suggestions in now, because in the next few months, I'm going to be wrapping up this alternative history playlist, and I'm going to be going on to film reviews. So get the ideas in while you can. And in the meantime, have a great day. And don't forget, the next video is going to be on what if Abraham Lincoln was assassinated during the Civil War. So this is again a video suggested by the same person, Greater McCheesy. So yeah, definitely stay tuned for that. And in the meantime, have a great day and bye.